Welcome back to another literary session of the Ladakh Literature Festival 2020. Our session for today is Emergence of Ladakhi Literature, a discussion between Rigzin Chosdon, Srimati Tsiring Chorol, Venerable Tsiring Chosvel. Rigzin Chorol is Research Associate at the Ladakh Arts and Media Organization in Leh. Her research focuses on the study of the history of print media and focuses on the Moravian missionary newspapers in Ladakh and Keelong in Lahore in the early 20th century. Tsiring Chorol is a Hindi lecturer at the Education Department of Leh Ladakh. She has translated a Ladakhi novel to Hindi as part of her research. Her interests lie in the study of the literature of Hindi and Ladakhi. Venerable Tsiring Chosvel has worked as an editor of a number of Ladakh Cultural Academy's Ladakhi publications. He has represented Ladakh in various national and international events and festivals in showcasing cham dance and village chanting. Join us in this discussion wherein we shall explore the emergence of Ladakhi literature in Ladakh.
Dedicated to the emerging literature of Ladakh, this multilingual panel in Ladakhi, Hindi and English language commemorates the genre of poetry, novel and literature often about the region. The speakers will present to you these genres in the historical context of its development and progress in contemporary times. Now I would like to request Venerable Tsiring Chosvel to talk about his presentation, which is titled Ladakhi Poetry, an overview of its development and progress.
Kasaju tene daksarik dini molkan nangzin la tene diringe tamshat jochesi tene jojiu tene Ladakh sinanga butkani lo ngapchu tukchi skabla tene sikshat somtang sina samshik yargyat sontiot teskor la nge ika tene dordushik jutesi sondushen tene ngatang changma kenken panok Ladakh yuljong ma jisa thokna rigyung thokna sherigi thokna lamluk sholi thokna tene mimang si joshi na jisa thoga ma zangpotang punchum sokspa yotkan bojaste la si mingbo demba nang gyagar zambulina mana mingchot gyurtenole somasang teo gyurchesi katinbo chi jaste nok dana la yuljong sina te rignas kuni jaste nok ka rignas kun Ladakh sina kyapstiot te uni nok spena rignas chewash nga juste rignas chungwash nga juste ta rignas chewash nga tang chungwash nga juna chia jon okjana teni rignas chewash nga nok darikpa satmarikpa zorikpa sorikpa teni nangton rikpa juste nga no khale teni rignas chunge na chanok snyanga ngonjot debjor zozgar tenatogla stis juste hale songbasang I rignas punchum sokspa yotkan bojaste Ladakh si mana Ladakh po punchum sokspe sherik tang rigjung yotkani mana yulji pya ngontenol songbasang ta diringe I digrim bina juches ponok skatik tang delteno hale skatik kazuga rigjung bo skatik ga raglasteno namjik tsakpa skatik punchum sokspa jig medna tene rigyung punchum sokspaji yongchespo ma kaxpono songbasang kazua nge ngon la juskan nangzin la rigna chesh nge nangna darik pa just terminale darik pa zedna skadi skorbono tale ta rigna chunge togna snyanngak juste kyak snyanngak po ngorjot po debjor zete sum yodenopa te changma tene darik pe skadi togna dusano khale songbasang 이 상마 스카딕이나 두스바상 스카딕지 야르갸즈라 경제스피아 이 응운 고산옥달레 스냥가 고산옥 뎁조르 고산옥 테나토글라 테네 머조트 고산옥 할리 송바상 테낭나 디링에 양이 직접 좀 땅이 뛰어 스냥가가 나요 칼라 포트리 주안옥 바타 잉글리시나 포트리 주안옥 할리 테네 이 나타나 자타직 몰렛나 할리 또 가출지가 가족 스페라 데모직 땅냠포 디고셋 좀고셋 요 스냔가 나샤티었ják 식스 쿠리카나 하고노 스냔메네 스냔 포자노 할리 막제나 스페라자노 스페라 냔 포직 가족시가 나타 미지가 촛죽은 저간 본 할리 송바상 대창마 테네 이 스냔가 포지 자스테 테네 나타가 법정 토바노 테비아 좀직 좀체스피아 스냔가 포면 메뚜 미롱아직 스냔가 메드나 좀만을 데모노티스 만메 캬칼리 송바상 어디 쪽시 직자디 좀부 디체스 피앙아타 스냔각 마장아 타즈메트 캬칼레 스냔각 포메트 카메 장고소 스냔각 자나 카주 한레 니 주스칸 보 쪽라 스페라 장포직 스페라 데모직 디체스 스냔페 ngakti 디체스 타 직자 다 스냔각 피나치 스코르샤다 녹데나 르갸니 스코르샤다 녹탈레 르갸н 자나 르갸ncha 녹탈레 르갸ncha 미 르갸ncha 이나조이 나타 딱치스 르갸ncha 온쪽파미나 대르갸ncha만 이나 스페라 오가주어 데모 지가 차주운 데스카니 지가 쪽쪽 단 스페기나 테나 뼈샤데오노 스냔가기 루스숨요노 야레 식자 시글룩 테닝 니스카시스칸지 테 지가 상가 식자 데모 차치스 시글룩 식자데나 포트리 시글룩자나 프로스바노파 teon ngata shatana ditana kazu demozik chachun kazu gyanjik taxte ngata te speraun mimangla chotun zerna ita te tuzla ish nyangak po met kamet wasano somade songbasang ta ish nyangari jongbo kaola daksanga tanga is lobjong chen yot ngata chichoksina himalay yuljong potang himalay yuljong gangpena ish nyangari depchi gyotyak ka debi minga nyangak melong ma jono khali ngata nyangak melong ma jono innazugi I nyangak melong ma stoma zat kanbo lobon danti jukan bono gyagar paji gyagari khaspa chenmoji stoma zatan khali tola juano kabya dar shastra zano khali kabya zana nyangak khali dar zana melong azano khali teni shastra zana stanchos nyangak melong ma zete ngatina tyojono somasang I gyagar pa khaspa chenmo danti stama zat kani te stanchos po gyatak chuksum pena podi khaspa chenbo lotawa shonton dorje gyatsan nincho tale hale ta kong is tene I nyangak po I kabedar shastrao tene mata podi skadina yana boti skadina yana Ladakh skat chizen hale te skat pena gyura zatyak somasang yu riknas jangchesi jungjigino pahale textbook chikto inok songbasang I textbook po ma common inok mi sangma inanga chang choluk tang direkte ina manametyak skadik chik kazuwa yargyas chon mi ji sperajik zer gona sam gona kazuk shia tene ngatang samsulbo mimang la ngon chugin zerkani te tokskun I achigena nyangak pina chiga shate don khale ngak melong menanga tene liu sum yote noklai te liu sum binangna tene liu tangpo liu ngispe nanga spena tongyan sumchu songa zerti kawenanga rangjin jot pergyan tene tola spergyan la sospa tene tongyan sumchu songa yote no tene liu sumpe nanga tene dargyan juste kawonla shabda lankar jonok tongyan bonok arta lankar jonok somasang I chiga nyangak melong me jungbola lobjong gyala jate chiga somna demba rang mana chiga somma punsum sokspa gyala ji yongchen ole songbasang khaspang unis I soksi tene chiga un kola jate hale gyanmun kola jate izuk somrik soma jate duk tyongi ja langyasla tene spetsul jiga tene nge chiga juna ju spena nyangak inangna gyan chikchigeno zungdan irgyan no khale somasang te skorla tene kanchen chewang ringzinis tene losari skorla somazatuk hale somasang khon istombono tene losar jon par lodap dasbuyo lomang galyang losar zatpani lotos sungmet loi lama ket lochung khos loi tingna chot lole lonar gaspe lokhor ngapa khos losar talo sespe koleskor Lorgyuz mangyang losas ningtonjik lorgan khos lotar jindu jiz molte konit tyo mola jata duk tena zungdan gyan tene gyan thupsan paldani tyo dugle thatok jare zungdan jashkani ka tyo stomaduk chozuk thundeli togaduk ajangle iskalbale zambuling diri chozuk mangyang choskis nington kun la chamstang sevelam lamjang drola phanchir sung moduk hali stonba sosue tustu sudak nyonmo wangishmos shmongfa selchir shirap ot ki zamling salwazat mote tena chogla skujab jamang gyalsan istyo stomazate duk hali tena zukchan irgyan kola jate duk tene jammi na lukshi iskola ko dia jate duk tene sadung gokchet lungkhor la sokpa 망두 꼴kyang sadung jiminus lungkor la jong dijon deiskyang sadung gyadla jostet jindu thong lo hale lus kis khala chuzin machiskyang lo le mulchi tang char hachu jindu bab sawe nyalwe nasus kezminkyang zodal sadung nyongos tetu jong mate do hale somasang tenna tsogla yang atang istomina tunong main be stomchulchik kashat stomchulba noktale yang tik kashat kana tang skanjik ha atsakpe tene ige un kola jate kashat stomchulba ma tunong main bajiga dano te thokpina dembarang ujung na pe tholop kangi ma non la juskan nangzin la I rignas kun yargyas pia chotna betkani mana roxtang gyan lan gyastang hoptung dang changme ma rogdel ma chenmojik yotenok somasang te jigina tene tene hoptuk changme daksi kashat toga stomza tenok tene chani lopte loptuk skyangi tene kashadi toga stom halam ngapchung ngabji tamjik chogdik joste tene shirig lobde le chogna spela zatenok kawla kashat lobmes ningtam juste hale songbasang teo mana yang mana rigjung pia ma jabdex ma gangstantik yu shirig lo chige ujung nampe tholop kangai chokna ino songbasang isoksi chigamun chogla tene nyangak melong me jungal janga zate stom zat gosis khaktani nogle songbasang 이 가족과 좀 것에 저까니 좀 출보 식사 좀 출보 이 다는 현각 멜롱메 중비나 샤테다노 송바상 뎀바랑 이 가족왕이 한라 주살레 이 rigna 치와스 나당 rigna 충와스 나 주스테 이 rignas 포스 추켈 홉종보다 dak상하다 독삼직살나 남 야갈라 장왕 톱 테스팅나 뎀바랑 남 우중낭 펠 톨롭캉 tene dembarang god suxpana hale te lopta god suxpana I rigna sangmes kolla tena lobjong punzum soxpa salin jiktano hale tena tokla jan lopta kangudina tene ngata skadi tokpo ma shukshan hale lopta kangudina podigi lobjong salanok tena tokla nyanga lobjong salanok songbasang I nguni jaste tene tenna lopta kangdang tenguri jaste tene ngatang I chisoxinanga tene dembarang I stom chuldang tene rang skadi to mariargas chenmo sontano khale songbasang yangte ngatang skadi tang tene stom chulina yargas chenmojik chachesir gyusan chenmo nisi noktale yang tik yang gyusan hale tiginok lenanga tene sherig lobde Ladakhi zo sherik tang skati lobde success tang tik le longtin tang success tang nis ingis ke ma contribution chenmo kyak ma rox chenmo kyak I sikcha di stom chulina to kazuga yot kyak juna ne to chigajun stitang ngatang I rigyung binanga poetic symposium somi dunsa ha ya mehfile mushara zete to tang chesi sholjik ngatang I yamali yuljongsena metpanok ngatang chigena innang namjik I lobdedang chigaun suksachik radio longtin kangun suksachik jan chisokskunina captured kani te somchulgun te digrimgun ngatang irwang adopt jostangachik laglenlan kyongstangachik dembarang ka skadiga mana tonang yotkani khaspatang te sangmala tene sikchadi somchuli chokla mashante spospatang mashante tuskap zangpojik topten khale tekana tene tyo topkan bejaste tene stom masang ma stom kan skyoda zateno somasang tene daksa chakpa tene I chiso chigena tene stomi mamangpo sikshade stom mamangpo stom stedeno spena khaspa sose chiga tuksam salnang tene khaspa gunis tene stomi chiga sikchadi stomde mamangpo stoma zateno kawenena khaspa guni nok tene skujab jamen gyalsan kanchen siwang rigdin skujab ngawang gyaso gyan tupsan paldan gyan konchok phande zarat tenna tokla yang khaspa mangpo jigyat ko halam khaspa nguni rangrang stom jaktom zate des pelkanbo nishu sumchik duk tyo menpa tene samshik tene stomi dunsa wedinanga tene sikchadi stom sala zatkani te khaspa changme tene stomun chogdik joste tene sherig lazde tene tuzdep Shiraze chulla Shiraze na spela zate te thokpina tene halam Shiraze dep sikchadi poetry dep hale nishu sanga ya sumchik toksik tena tontakpo ma ta 이 지게나 아족 독삼직 살라직 직자 somtang yargyasi toga samno salachik teni stompape chanang mana tangska mamang poskyotok stomdevi chana tuksam salnang mamang po chigaskyotok teni stomsulina ma yargyas ma chenmojik yonsoale songbasang ta 이 tuskap nyun binanga tayang stomsuli tokbinang nangye chungunjik spejik ta chikchik toksik justen bahale spegina skujab jamang geltani tyor samazate to kale ta jammu askyote tenna nazuk spalazik te kon somjik salduk te charte satpena jami satpena tyo moduk sadung gorchet lungkor la sospa mangdu kolkyang sadung jiminus lungkor lajung tijon te iskyang sadung rgyadla jorchet jindu tong hale ta tik nispa luski khala chudin machiskyang ngulchi rangchar hachu jindu bab 사회 얄외 나스 스케즈민창 조달 사둥 용고스 테투중 이나가타 다치 냥가이 테 지그나시나 요트카니 죽찬이 간저칸 보 이나가 콘디 콜라자테두가 치아자나 죽스포당 남카오 지가 죽스 코다자테도 스페기나 루스키 칼라자나 죽스포 남케 죽스 코테 테니 죽스페 남카 추진 맨낭 가즈와 죽스페카 추진 자나 다 신라잖아 할 추진 코르테 미눅바 자노 나마 신 코르테 미눅바 인낭 할레 patmana pat sharpa mana izuk shukshan babsto zano hale babsto zano hale somasante chigena sawe nyallesh nasu skezmin kyang zodal sadung yongos tetujung sawe nyalle sanyalina ngatang skeste meno zano innang izuk sat mana sanyal tsoksi mana chiga kangalbo 이 이삼 삿바둑 zerkanni chiga tsoksik tena kote dugale somasang ta inna tsogla tene kazua daktangi juskan nanzinla kaspa mamang poji jaksom sala zate duk somasang tene kazuga iskadiga tonang yotkan changmas nyanga melongma kabe dash juste te chiga rigyung bola tosam zate tene rang skadik chukpo zatchestang tene te gyantang dante kazukshik ngata samlo ngonchuget teun ma demodang nyampo ma rigyung punsum soxpajik gyur tupjesi tene rewatang nyampo tene ngai izamshika sarchiwenale tuechele.
Thank you, Venerable Siring Chospelle. And to sum up his lovely presentation, I would like to briefly mention what he said in English for our audience who do not understand Ladakhi. So he talked about the last 50 to 60 years in which the development of poetry happened in Ladakh, and he talks about the 10 sciences, the 5 major sciences, which include the science of languages, arts and crafts, science of healing arts, science of logic, and science of philosophy, and the 5 smaller sciences, which include poetry, style of writing, synonyms, theatre, and astrology. While his focus is on poetry, he talks about how poetry developed in this region, and the major contribution towards learning of poetry is the book which is called the Snyanak Melongma. In Hindi it's called Kavya Darsh Shastra by Lopon Danti from India. And this particular text was translated in the 13th century by Lotsawa Tsongston Dorje Gyaltsen into Tibetan, and henceforth used in the region of Ladakh to learn about the different composition, style of writing and composition in Ladakh. He says that this particular text is very secular in nature, and it helps to learn one's language and script, and how a language and script can be developed further to communicate with each other. Venerable Chospel also mentions 3 different composition by experts who have published their work in the Jammu and Kashmir Academy of Art, Culture and Languages, Leh. The first poem is by Gen Kanchan Sewang Rigzinle, and the title of his poem is Losar. This follows the style called Sugdan Gyan, where the first word of each phrase is the same. The second composition is by Gen Thupstan Paldanle, and the title of this work is called Chosluk Tundel, Religious Harmony, where the Thatok Tsundan style is used, wherein the last word of each phrase and the first word of the second phrase is the similar. And the third is example. The poem is by Professor Jamyang Gyalsan. The title of the poem is about Jammu, and this follows the Tsukchan Gyan, wherein metaphors and similes are used to talk about a certain phenomenon. And lastly, he talks about the use of letters, which is also called Kashat. And the title, he talks about a book wherein the alphabets K to Ha, A, the consonants in the Tibetan script, have been used, and 54 poems have been composed by 54 poets who are mostly students from Central Institute for Buddhist Studies, and these have also been published by the Academy. And at the end of his presentation, he talks about the establishment of the Jammu and Kashmir Academy of Art, Culture and Languages, and the establishment of the radio station in Leh, which contributed in the advancement or development of poetic compositions by several authors in this region. And he concludes by stating that poetry is still in its very nascent form. However, if anyone interested in poetry learns the style of writing and composition through the book Snyanak Melongma or Kavya Darsh Shastra by Lopon Danti, then one can be more creative towards such compositions. Thank you so much, Venerable Tsering Chospelle. Now I would like to invite Dr. Tsering Chorole to present her paper on the genre of novel, and the title of her presentation is Tsewang Tolden's Contribution to Ladakhi Literature.
किसी भाषा की जो कुछ लिखित और मौखिक साहित्यिक धरोहर होती है, उसे हम उस भाषा का साहित्य कहते हैं। साहित्य अपने समाज की प्रचलित सोच, उसकी आस्थाएं, चाल चलन, रीति रिवाज आदि का एक चित्र हमारे सामने प्रस्तुत करता है। इस दृष्टि से समाज की उन्नति और अवनति से साहित्य का सीधा सरोकार होता है, क्योंकि वह हमें अतीत और वर्तमान का नक्शा दिखाकर एक तरह से भविष्य के लिए मार्ग भी दिखाता है। साहित्य की अनेक विधाएं होती हैं, जैसे कहानी, कविता, नाटक, उपन्यास, यात्रावृत्त आदि आदि। लद्दाख की बात करें तो हम पाते हैं कि यहाँ के साहित्यकारों ने विभिन्न विधाओं को अपनी कलम से उन्नत किया है। मैं आज बात करूंगी लद्दाखी साहित्य में उपन्यास लेखन, विशेषकर त्सेवांग तोल्दन का अपने उपन्यासों के माध्यम से लद्दाखी साहित्य में योगदान के विषय पर। त्सेवांग तोल्दन लद्दाख के आल्ची गांव से थे। वे लंबे समय तक आकाशवाणी लेह में न्यूज रीडर के तौर पर कार्यरत रहे। उनके साथ 2014 में हुए एक साक्षात्कार के दौरान उन्होंने बताया कि लेखन में उनकी रुचि उन्हीं दिनों तीव्र हुई। हिंदी साहित्य में भी अपनी रुचि के बारे में उन्होंने बात की। वे मानते थे कि लद्दाखी के लेखन की शैली अगर सरल हो तो लोगों में अपनी भाषा को लिखने पढ़ने की लालसा में बढ़ोतरी हो सकती है। इसी विश्वास को ठोस रूप देते हुए उन्होंने अपना पहला उपन्यास मिक गीतामक एकदम बोलचाल की सरल भाषा में प्रस्तुत किया। ऐसा करने पर हालांकि उन्हें बहुत सारे विरोधों का सामना करना पड़ा। अपने अगले दो उपन्यास जोम्स्कल और याफिस को लिखते समय फिर तोल्दन ने भाषा की विद्वानों की मदद ली। ये दो उपन्यास हालांकि प्राचीन तिब्बती के भाषिक नियमों का उल्लंघन नहीं करते, फिर भी लद्दाखी भाषा और उसकी लिपि का कुछ ज्ञान रखने वाले पाठकों को आसानी से समझ आ जाते हैं। लद्दाख की अपनी भाषा में उपन्यास लेखन करने वाले त्सेवांग तोल्दन पहले लेखक हैं और शायद इकलौते भी। इनके उपन्यासों की विशेषता का आकलन करने के लिए हम इनके अंतिम उपन्यास याफिस को लेते हैं। इस उपन्यास में लेखक ने भारत की आज़ादी के पहले के लद्दाख की दयनीय स्थिति का मार्मिक चित्र हमारे सामने रखा है। साथ ही उस समय की प्रचलित सोच, प्रथाएं आदि भी उपन्यास में उजागर हुए हैं। उपन्यास की कथा वस्तु लद्दाख में कुछ दशकों पहले तक भी प्रचलित एक प्रथा पर आधारित है, जिसके तहत संपत्ति के उत्तराधिकार को लेकर दो भाइयों में उनके अपने ही पिता द्वारा भेदभाव किया जाता था। संपत्ति पर पूरा अधिकार बड़े बेटे का होता था और छोटे बेटे को एक तरह से उसका अनुचर ही मान लिया जाता था। हालात इतने बुरे थे कि कोई पिता अपनी बेटी का हाथ किसी घर के छोटे बेटे के हाथ में देने से कतराते थे। तोल्दन जी ने अपने साक्षात्कार में बताया था कि लद्दाख को जब शुरू में एसटी का दर्जा मिला था, तब इसी भेदभाव के कारण छोटे भाइयों के एसटी सर्टिफिकेट बनने में बड़ी मुश्किलें आती थी, और क्योंकि उनके पास अपने ज़मीन के कोई कागजात नहीं होते थे। बहुत सारे लोगों के पास किसी और के घर जमाई बनकर या मठवासी होकर मठ में रहने के अलावा कोई चारा ही नहीं बचता था, क्योंकि उनके अपने घर में उनसे परायों जैसा व्यवहार किया जाता था। एक उपन्यासकार के तौर पर त्सेवांग तोल्दन ने अपनी वह भूमिका बखूबी निभाई है जो हर लेखक की जिम्मेदारी है कि अपने वक्त और समाज की सच्चाई को आगे रखे, चाहे वह कितना ही कड़वा क्यों ना हो। शायद ही इनसे पहले किसी ने भी इस क्रूर परंपरा पर उंगली उठाई हो। या फिर इस उपन्यास के प्रमुख पात्र का नाम त्सेवांग है, जो कि एक हठी पिता का छोटा बेटा है। बचपन से लेकर जवानी तक पिता के हाथों उसके भावनाओं से जो खिलवाड़ होता है, उसे उपन्यासकार ने बड़े ही मार्मिक शब्दों में चित्रित किया है। आगे चलकर त्सेवांग का ठोस इरादा और मेहनत कैसे उसके जीवन की दशा और दिशा को बदल देते हैं, इसका भी चित्रण बहुत सुंदरता से लेखक करते हैं। लेखक ने पूरे उपन्यास में गांव और शहर का, पुराने और नए का, परंपरा और आधुनिकता का एक संतुलन बिठाया है। उपन्यास के शुरू के भाग में मवेशी चराना, टीन का डब्बा बजाते नाच गाना करना, बीमार होने पर केवल गांव के वैद्य का सहारा होना आदि पुराने समय के लद्दाख का चित्र दिखाते हैं। वहीं उपन्यास के दूसरे भाग में पिकनिक पर जाना, गाड़ी में घूमना, अस्पताल में इलाज कराना आदि दृश्य एक बदले हुए आधुनिक लद्दाख का चित्र हमारे सामने रखते हैं। गांव और शहर या प्राचीन और नवीन की इस यात्रा को बहुत ही स्वाभाविक रूप में उपन्यास में पाठक देख पाता है, जो बिल्कुल भी बनावटी नहीं लगता। एक गरीब क्षेत्र का अनेक कठिनाइयों के बीच भी फलता हुआ जीवन और अभाव के बीच भी मानव का कभी ना हारता हौसला, और इन्हीं परिस्थितियों में उपजी बहुपतिवाद जैसी प्रथा का भी उल्लेख इस उपन्यास में प्रमुखता से हुआ है। खान पान, पहनावा, रीति रिवाज, छंग और सत्तू सब त्सेवांग तोल्दन के इस उपन्यास में सुंदरता से पाठक की आंखों के आगे तैरते हैं। उदाहरण के लिए सत्तू की अगर हम बात करें, लद्दाखी जीवन में सत्तू का महत्व केवल अन्न की दृष्टि से नहीं है। सत्तू यहाँ के सामाजिक, धार्मिक, वैचारिक जीवन में यूं मिला हुआ है कि आप इसके अभाव में लद्दाखी जीवन की कल्पना भी नहीं कर पाएंगे। सत्तू तक की कमी होना, इस मुहावरे का अर्थ जानने वाला समझता है कि यहाँ के जीवन में इस खाद्य पदार्थ की क्या भूमिका है। उपन्यास में इस मुहावरे को भी स्थान मिला है और इससे जुड़ी हुई भावना को भी। इस तरह यह उपन्यास कई स्तरों पर अपनी छाप छोड़ता है। लद्दाखी जीवन का एक पूरा चित्र इस उपन्यास के माध्यम से पाठक तक पहुंचता है। त्सेवांग तोल्दन हमारे सामने एक ऐसे साहसी लेखक के रूप में उभरते हैं, जिन्होंने एक तरफ समाज की एक ऐसी कुप्रथा का खुलकर विरोध किया जिसके भीतर सदियों लद्दाख के अनेक बेटे प्रताड़ित हुए, और अपनी बात रखने के लिए उन्होंने भाषा को बहुत जटिल नहीं किया। उन्होंने एकदम सरल भाषा में अपनी बात कही। उनका महत्व इस दृष्टि से भी है कि उनके उपन्यासों के द्वारा उन्होंने आने वाले अनेक लेखकों के लिए एक मार्ग बनाया है। इसमें संदेह नहीं है कि आगे चलकर अनेक अन्य लद्दाखी उपन्यास लेखन की ओर अग्रसर होंगे, और यही त्सेवांग तोल्दन की सफलता का सबसे बड़ा प्रमाण होगा। साक्षात्कार के दौरान उन्होंने ये भी बताया था कि उन्होंने कुछ भारतीय और रूसी कहानियों का भी लद्दाखी अनुवाद किया है। खेद की बात है कि मेरी भेंट उनसे इस साक्षात्कार के बाद फिर नहीं हो पाई और फिर उनके देहावसान के बाद उन किताबों को देख पाने की जो एक आशा थी वो भी कमज़ोर होती चली गई। उन रचनाओं का भी अध्ययन भाषा और साहित्य की उन्नति की दृष्टि से बहुत ज़रूरी है और अगर उनके परिवारजन उनकी उन कृतियों को सार्वजनिक करने के पक्ष में हैं तो ये बहुत ही अच्छा होगा लद्दाखी साहित्य के लिए। उसकी लद्दाखी साहित्य की यात्रा में ये एक महत्वपूर्ण पड़ाव का आरंभ बन सकता है। एक सफल उपन्यास के अनेक पहलू होते हैं जिन पर छेवांग तोल्दन के उपन्यास खरे उतरते हैं, जैसे पात्र योजना, संवाद, कथा वस्तु, देश काल आदि सारे बिंदुओं पर उनके उपन्यास एकदम खरे उतरते हैं। यहाँ मैं उनके दूसरे उपन्यास जोम्स्कल के शुरू के पृष्ठ का कुछ अंश आपके सामने पढ़ूंगी। भाषा और शैली दोनों में ही उनकी पकड़ को आप यहाँ महसूस कर पाएंगे। नीमार गाशेस ला ठेत ला जारिन जारिन डागजांग रेना चिपा गुन तंग री इचु कुनिस रंगरंगी छंग ला छाछा सिफिया रंगरंगी ठोपा कुन ला लोन जेरते चिरित चारत मंगपोस कांगिन छोक छंग मा तार तुर जेरिन मंगपोजिक हिलिंग्स तांगिन उरत का फोलोंग तंग स्वा बुरसे छंग में सेपना शाकपा कुनी संग शोकशी शोकशी शोक 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 मंगपोस कातना छोड़ते दिसकी दिस थोतपे का लकपा तंगस्ते नमखाल तस्पा नीमार गाशेसला थोगांगा संग मांगा मेतक्याक। यहाँ लेखक ने बहुत ही सुंदरता से सूर्यास्त की बेला का चित्रण किया है। अपनी बात को इन शब्दों के साथ समाप्त करूंगी कि भाषा संस्कृति की वाहिका है। भाषा के संरक्षण के लिए आवश्यक है कि उसमें अधिक से अधिक लोग पढ़ें, लिखें और उसका इस्तेमाल करें। छेवांग तोल्दन का अपनी भाषा और साहित्य के प्रति प्रेम उनके उपन्यासों में साफ झलकता है और लद्दाखी साहित्य और भाषा को उन्नति की ओर ले जाने में उनका बहुत बड़ा योगदान है, इसमें कोई संदेह नहीं है।
Thank you, Dr. Tsering Chorol, for your wonderful presentation in Hindi. To sum up her presentation, she talks about how literature mirrors a society's lifestyle, thinking, and its culture, and how literature can also be a reflection of the past, present, and a direction towards the future of a region. Here she introduces to us Tsewang Toldanle, who is from Alchi village. Tsewang Toldanle worked as a newsreader with All India Radio, and that is when his interest in writing developed. She mentions the first novel written by him called Mikki Tamak, which is written in simple Ladakhi, and that faced a lot of backlash. For the next two novels that he wrote, he consulted scholars of Bodhi language, and these two novels do not deviate much from the classical Tibetan rules of writing and can easily be understood by someone who has some knowledge of language and the script. She mentions that he believed that if people wrote in simpler style, their interest in reading and writing their own language would increase. She goes on to talk about the main novel that she translated called Yapes. Yapes also means discrimination in English. Here, the protagonist of this novel is someone who is the younger son of an adamant father. The novel speaks about the inhuman treatment that the younger son receives throughout his childhood at the hands of his own father, and how through his hard work and determination in the course of time, it changes the course of his life. The novel is based on a custom that was prevalent in Ladakh and is just a few decades ago, wherein the younger son would be left with no land holdings, and the sole heir would be the eldest son. So the younger son would have to either marry someone else and leave the house, or go away and join a monastic institution. So Toldal emerges as a very courageous writer who writes and speaks fearlessly about the injustice during his time, and in doing so he keeps his language simple. So she concludes by stating how this particular genre of novel, has never been experimented upon, wherein he was the first one to develop this style, paves the way for future writers. And during an interview with him, Chorol mentions that he had also translated a lot of Russian as well as Indian stories into Ladakhi. Therefore, this presentation does highlight upon how different genres are slowly emerging, and how a novel form in Ladakhi, especially in Ladakhi, which literature of any country or region is strongly connected to its historical past and legacies in the oral as well as the written form. The historical records of present-day Ladakh dates back to the 10th century. However, its oral tradition and folklore passed on from generation to generation through word of mouth cannot be traced to a particular time period. Oral transmissions, including folklore, songs, proverbs, epics and ballads, a tradition commonly used by the masses in comparison to the Buddhist as well as Muslim religious liturgy, which is accessible only to few, was exclusive for few sections of the Ladakhi society. The historical purview of the region has rightly been summarized by John Bray. He states, quote, from the late 7th or early 8th century until sometime after 842 AD, it was part of the Tibetan Empire. From the mid-10th century until 1834, Ladakh was an independent kingdom. At its height in the mid-17th century, it extended as far as Rudok, Gugi and Purang, in what is now western Tibet. In its final years, its territory corresponds roughly with today's Leh and Kargil districts, including with addition of Spiti. In 1834, Ladakh was invaded by the army of Raja Gulab Singh of Jammu, and it finally lost its independence in 1842. 4 years later, it was incorporated into the new princely state of Jammu and Kashmir, which acknowledged British paramountcy within the Indian Empire. Since 1947, it has remained part of J&K within the Independent Republic of India, unquote. And most recently, Ladakh has been given the status of a union territory in October 2019 by the Indian government. Ladakh has a rich background of language, literature, culture, art, architecture, including traditional knowledge systems as well as practices, which has been brought into the limelight by scholars within as well as from outside Ladakh. These historical as well as literary writings on Ladakh in various scripts and languages such as the Tibetan script, Urdu, Persian, Hindi, and eventually in English creates a canon which is still evolving and developing in progress. An imperative question is, how do we see the literature of Ladakh? Is it defined by writings in the regional languages with a readership within the region, or is it defined through the emerging trends of writings in the popular language English and other languages which has a wider readership? These are some important questions which will always remain open to different interpretations. In this presentation, I would like to make an attempt to briefly touch upon the timeline in which this canon of Ladakhi literature with focus on the writings in the English language, how these developed, which of course is also open to interpretations by individuals studying the same. The major sections, keeping the history in mind, its development and the evolving writing trends, I tried to divide the time period into the following: 18th century, the 19th century, 20th century, and the 21st century. As you all know that most of the Buddhist canonical texts have been written in the Buddhic script, and Ladakh developed its Buddhist religion and liturgy under the rule of the Tibetan kings. Therefore, Thomi Sambuta's book Sumchupa and Staks Ki Jukpa is important in the context of Ladakh, because the Ladakhi language has been written down in the Bodhic script, wherein Bodh means Tibet and Yek means Yige, script, letter or script. The first classification of literature had already begun in the Buddhist monastic institutions with works in the Tibetan classical script. The texts passed on from Tibet have been used by Buddhist monks to learn the teachings of Buddha, and this in a way created a hegemonic presence of a group of elite group of clergy who then had an upper hand over the common people. So on the one hand, we had the literate Buddhists, and on the other hand, a dominant group eventually emerged. with the Muslim conquest of Ladakh, which started in 1420s during the rule of Takpa Bumde, until the 1600s when Islam started spreading into Ladakh and conversion of people began. Islam established its presence mainly in places like Purik, the area around Kargil, comprising the Suru Valley, Pashkum, Mulbek, Bodh Kharbu, Shakar Chiktan, who, as Janet Rizvi states, were bound in a loose quasi-feudal relationship to the Ladakhi monarchy. Urdu and Persian languages also started to be used. Henceforth, religion and written liturgy were interconnected and inseparable, and a hierarchy among the people of Ladakh could be felt, with the kings on the top, the clergy in the middle, and the common man below, wherein they mostly used the oral form of expressions through oral traditions. Moving on to the 19th century, while this hierarchy was being maintained for centuries, a new wave of writing started emerging within the region when it was started being explored by Europeans. Unlike other literary works in Europe, the early English works in the region of Ladakh included historical texts, hunting expeditions, survey literature, field literature, among others, that started forming the base to record more about the region. To name few works of these writers, the earliest traveler was Ippolito Desideri, an Italian Jesuit who came here in 1715 while on his way to Lhasa. Other important 19th century visitors include William Moorcroft, a veterinary surgeon in the service of the East India Company, who, along with his companion George Trebeck, spent 2 years in this region from 1820 to 22, and they wrote together the famous book Travels in the Himalayan Provinces of Hindustan and the Punjab in Ladakh and Kashmir in Peshawar, Kabul, Kunduz, and Bukhara in 1837. Furthermore, some of the other pioneering work in regard to the use of English language has been done by Alexander Choma Dikoros, the famous Hungarian scholar. He lived in Zangskar under the tutelage of learned monks in Zangla and Puktal, where he lived between 1820 and 1830, and there he wrote the grammar of Tibetan language in English and the life and teaching of Buddha. And this laid the foundation of Tibetan studies, and later he was also called as the father of modern Tibetology. Heinrich August Jeschka, a Moravian missionary who arrived in Ladakh in 1896, also started translating the Bible, and he even compiled the Tibetan English Dictionary in 1881. Through him, there were many other European scholars who studied the language of this region, and therefore this shift from a monastic study of language, the education system also improved towards the end of the 19th century when Moravian missionaries arrived in Ladakh. They started teaching subjects like mathematics, English, social sciences, and Bible studies. The first formal school in Ladakh was established by them in October 1899, and it was called the Moravian Mission School, and this school still caters to the need of education in lay and has been very successful in spreading modern education. In 1854, Alexander Cunningham, who had visited Ladakh, also produced a very detailed book called Ladakh, Physical, Statistical and Historical. This work has been maintained as a standard text for referencing for many years. There are many other authors who have also contributed to the first base of writings on the region. In the meantime, while traders and other business transactions were happening in this region, given that Ladakh was a transit for many traders along the Silk Road of Central Asia, this can be understood by the book written by Jacqueline Fox in the book titled Trade and Contemporary Society Along the Silk Road, an ethno-history of Ladakh, where she mentions the Khan archives, which is the primary source of her book. She mentions that a majority of the archival papers were written in Urdu. Some documents were partially or wholly written in Bodhiak, English, Uyghur, and Persian. And most of the descendants of Central Asian traders in Leh could fluently read and write Urdu. However, the Urdu of these documents were difficult for modern readers to read, since it was written in the Patawar type style or the traditional style of writing Urdu. Moving on to the 20th century, while the missionaries were trying to reinforce the spoken words by producing wide variety of written literature, they also studied the language to create interest among the local people towards Christianity, who could only read Ladakhi, and began publishing tracts, hymns, and other works in Ladakhi. The Moravian Church also used their own press in Leh as well as Kelang for such purposes. The pioneering Moravian missionaries who compiled these texts have created a plethora of textbooks, especially when it comes to the academic study of the region, beginning with Dr. Karl Marx, a fully trained missionary doctor by profession, came to Ladakh in 1886 and compiled what can be termed as the first manuscripts on the history of Ladakh in Ladakhi. It is called the 3 documents relating to the history of Ladakh, or the Ladakhi Chronicles. One of the most extensive works done in the by the missionary scholar is Reverend August Hermann Franke, who reached Ladakh in 1896. His work as a historian and a writer of folklore is commendable. He wrote over 60 learned articles on Ladakhi language, legends, songs, rock carvings, archaeology in the Tibetan script, as well as translations in English. He copied the lower version of Gyalam's he copied what is called the lower version of Gyalam Kesar from Meme Dunduptashi of Gyatso and Meme Yishi of Sabipa. And in the year 1909, Franke conducted a tour of the borders of Western Tibet and published what is called the Antiquities of Indian Tibet in 2 volumes, both published on behalf of the Archaeological Survey of India. Moving on, he also published the first Tibetan language monthly newspaper in 1904 called Ladakhi Akbar in colloquial Ladakhi, and introduced the medium of print for masses, and henceforth created a shift, making information available for general public to read. The paper was also published from Kelang as Kelang Akbar by Reverend Walter Osbo in 1927, and later as Ladakh's Phongya from 1935 onwards up till 1950s by Ilya Chetan Phuntsok and Reverend Pierre Vitos. Joseph Gergen, another leading scholar of Ladakh, also wrote many texts in translation both in Ladakhi as well as in English. In the 21st century, a lot of writings written by local scholars, which have also been highlighted upon by Venerable Sring Chospel in his presentation in Ladakhi, have been written and published by the Jammu and Kashmir Academy of Arts, Culture and Language. Here I have tried to classify them as under the broad title as religious literature, historical literature, cultural literature and travel literature, to cite just few examples out of the many authors who we have here. I would like to talk about Bakula Rangdol Nima Rinpoche's book called it's called Ishe Spe Springik, which is I would like to talk about Bakula Rangdol Nima's book, which is called The Good-Hearted Letter, published in 2014. It's a translation of Arya Nagarjuna's book, and it has been translated into both English as well as Ladakhi. Similarly, we have Zainul Abidin Abidi, who published The Emergence of Islam in Ladakh, published in 2019, and that is also a translation of Hashmatullah Khan's book written in Urdu. We have, among other writers, we have Joseph Gergen, Tashi Rabkesley, who also wrote the first, compiled the first book or history book on Ladakh, and the translation into English has also been done. Similarly, Venerable Thupstan Palden, Venerable Konchok Phande, Abdul Ghani Sheikh, all of them have contributed a lot to the writings of the region of Ladakh in English and in translation. To conclude, I would like to talk about one of the first books written by a Ladakhi in English, that is Ghulam Rasul Galwan's book called Servant of Sahibs. It was published in 1923. It's a secular autobiographical account which itself creates an identity of the author who always wanted to publish in English. Similarly, Abdul Wahid Radhu's book Caravan Tibetan, written in French in 1981, was also translated in 1997 into English, which is also a very interesting account of his travels. Therefore, I would like to conclude and talk about how the current institutions and establishments here in Ladakh, like Jammu and Kashmir Academy of Art, Culture and Languages, established in 1969, how several authors, mostly men but few women, contributed to the publication of the annual publication called Sheraza and the annual book called Lokhor Gitip. And we also have a lot of young authors who are now writing their blogs, writing books, publishing their poetry in English language. That is something that every younger people and younger generation of people are more comfortable writing in. But the question is, there has also been a lot of engagement of the literati in Ladakh who are focusing on the regional language and how one should write more in Ladakhi. Therefore, Ladakhi literature in English is evolving and building up every year. However, at the same time, attempts towards the preservation of the Ladakhi language is being made by concerned speakers of the region. Therefore, there's this constant tussle and this urgency to write as well as speak in Ladakhi, which is being shaped up and which is being shaped up in the region and undergoing a lot of engagement with the modern world due to the growing of tourism. This leads us to the question of where the development of the literature is heading towards. Should the development be more focused on the urgency to write in Ladakhi, or should the writers or their writings be left to the language that they are comfortable in? And how do readers and their response towards such works create the sense of identity and associations with such literary works? Thank you. And I would like to thank all the presenters for today who talked about the emerging Ladakhi literature in poetry, novel form, and the presentation I made on the literature that developed in Ladakh while giving an overview of literature in this region in English language. Thank you so much for being present and listening to the entire panel.